This video is going to look at the structure and properties of fatty acids and triacylglycerols. Fatty acids are long-chain carboxylic acids. They have between 12 and 20 carbons in them, and they have, as I mentioned, a carboxylic acid functional group. So in the one that is printed here, you have that carboxylic acid functional group at the top here, and then your long carbon chain down here. The only other functional group that they can have in them is one or more carbon-carbon double bond, but otherwise it's just a long carbon chain with a carboxylic acid functional group. They're part of the lipids biomolecules, which means that they are nonpolar and they're not going to be soluble in water. And if there are no carbon-carbon double bonds like the example that I have shown here, that would be considered a saturated fatty acid. Saturated, you can think of saturated means being full of, well, since our only carbon-carbon single bonds, it's kind of full of hydrogens. It has as many hydrogens as possible. So that's what it's saturated with, if you will. If it has one carbon-carbon double bond in there, then it would be an unsaturated. If it has more than one, you could call it a polyunsaturated fatty acid. And so those double bonds can affect the structure. And when you affect or change the structure of a molecule, you're going to change how it behaves, some of the properties that it has. And so this picture that I'm showing you there shows the space-filling model of saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids. The red molecules are the oxygens, the gray are the carbon, and then the white are the hydrogens. And so the first one listed there is saturated, and it's really just a pretty straight chain. There's not any bend or kink in it. The unsaturated, I have 3 examples listed here. The first one has a trans double bond, and so it's kind of hard to see, but that trans double bond is going to be right there. So I'm going to draw the double bond right there. And then you have a hydrogen right here on this side. Here's the other hydrogen on the other side. So trans meaning those hydrogens are on opposite sides of that double bond. The next one, you have a cis double bond, and it would be right here. It's a little easier to see. You can see those hydrogens are on the same side of the molecule. Now, in the trans double bond, going back to that one, if you look at the shape, it's very similar to a saturated fatty acid. So it's going to behave and have a lot of similar properties as saturated fatty acids do. The unsaturated with the cis double bond where the hydrogens are on the same side, it puts a bend in it. We no longer have a straight fatty acid. Now we have one with a nice bend in it. And so that is going to affect how it behaves, what those properties are. And then the last one has 2 cis double bonds there. You can see those hydrogens are on the same side, and then here's another one where those hydrogens are on the same side of the molecule, and it puts a really big bend in there as well. And so those bends affect the properties that those fatty acids have. And we'll get into how that does that in just a minute, but let's look right now at triacylglycerols or triglycerides, and these are what we know as fats and oils. And these are a glycerol molecule bonded to 3 fatty acids. And so the glycerol is from, or these 3 carbons that are listed here is from the glycerol, and then has 3 hydroxyl groups. So it'd be these 3 oxygens are from the glycerol molecule. And then they form an ester bond to the fatty acids. Those 3 fatty acids can be the same. They can be 3 different fatty acids. It doesn't really matter, but together it's a triglyceride or triacylglycerol. So again, from one glycerol bonded to 3 fatty acids. As I mentioned, these are what we know as fats and oils. So fats come from animals, and they generally contain more saturated fatty acids. They have those straight chain fatty acids, more saturated. And they're mostly solids at room temperature. Whereas oils come from plants, and they generally contain more unsaturated fatty acids. Those are the ones, if you remember from the previous slide, have the bend or the kink in them. And they are mostly liquids at room temperature. And so Fats are mostly solids, and the triacylglyceride that I have on the screen right here would be a fat. It has 3 saturated fatty acids. They're straight. They pack together pretty close. This is one triacylglyceride molecule. You'd have a whole lot of them together. But since they can pack so close together because they do have those straight chains and they can all line up together, they're going to exclude water from that, and they're going to have a lot of hydrophobic interactions between the triglyceride, one molecule, and another triglyceride molecule, which means that it just takes more energy to separate them apart, which is why their melting points are higher, which is why they're generally solids at room temperature. So that structure of them being straight chains and not having a bend or a kink in it leads to higher melting points, leads to them being solids at room temperature. So let's look at another example of a triglyceride. This one has a, this example shows with the fatty acids having a cis double bond in there, so it puts a bend in it. And so if you look at this structure right here, this would be considered an oil. It's going to have a lower melting point than fats with saturated fatty acids in them. Because of their structure, because you have these bends in there, they can't pack as closely and tightly together. They're going to kind of be jumbled up, and that leaves some space in between, so you don't get those hydrophobic interactions between molecules, between the triglyceride molecules. And so it doesn't take as much energy to separate them. To go from a solid to a liquid, you have to separate the molecules and allow them to move past one another. So since you don't have as many interactions to separate, it doesn't require as much energy. Happens at a lower temperature. So these have lower melting points than fats do generally. And so that's generally why oils are liquids at room temperature, whereas fats are solids at room temperature.